Yeah, welcome together. Semester is coming to an end, so do the lectures. We have today one about chronic effects of chronic stimulation. So what can happen if we really do it 24/7? Next week is about safety, different aspects. And the last one, which I still need to assemble, is about sensory feedback and latest research and comparison about the methods and effects. I go with Mozart, who should have said that he has all the opera already in his brain and not yet on the paper. So same with that last lecture. So effects of chronic stimulation is all written in this famous book here, and I have it with me today, the old one, for a certain reason. So this is the Bible in paper, and that comes later on for today for another purpose. So if we talk about chronic electrical stimulation, so nothing you do, let's say, for 10 minutes, but something which you would like to do for a whole day. Yeah. For example, if we think about paralyzed persons who need that for grasping, that means it's not really continuously 60 minutes, an hour for 24 hours for whatever, but it's something which you cannot do just for 10 minutes. So the question, if you do something like this and you observe changes, is the question, where does something happen? Then of course after that, if you discover something happens and you find out where does it happen, what does happen? And the third question that is always important, beyond fundamental research, is the question, do we mind, or is it troublesome, or can we ignore that, right? So some things happen and they are not important for that purpose, and then we can say, well, if I try to oversee that, and then I'm happy with that. The where, if we stimulate, is here the nerve and the muscle at first spot where changes happen. We have changes in metabolism, and we have also changes if we do that stimulation thing for a longer time in morphology. And if we see that we have changes in metabolism and morphology is if you would do endurance sports, then you would change your muscle metabolism and probably also your force characteristics. If we now look on still nowadays application systems, we quite often have open loop. That means we have to identify our plant, so our muscle, the human body wants, set parameters and then work with those parameters. And if we do not have an update of this plant identification, we might control with the wrong parameters. So that is the beauty in closed loop control, that you always measure the outcome and then adapt the controller, setting a new set point or changing parameters. Question is always, if you want to go towards closed loop control, how can you do that? And since there are now more control lectures than 10 years ago, I skipped that repetition here. So remember, if you want to control something, you should identify the correct parameters. And this is something where you can get in dispute with biologists or neuroscientists, because quite often we as engineers forget that hierarchical control, and the neuroscientists also forget some of the levels of that hierarchical control. If I would grasp that book here, and I would say I cannot feel it, an answer from the neuroscientist side or from many others too, would say, well, but you can see what you do. So visual control is a kind of feedback, right? But my answer would be, I can also feel the book if I close my eyes. Yeah, how does that come? And then comes the other loop. That would mean you can do certain purposes with an alternative input, vision instead of sensory feedback, but you have your limitations. And the whole truth is, if you would completely neglect the visual feedback, that your control would be less effective and less efficient. And this is something we should keep in mind. And if you remember whatever you heard about control, you might have heard that you need state space variables. So you have to measure something, and that should be observable. If you cannot measure that, you cannot use that variable. If you cannot measure that, you can take fancy mathematics and estimate that. And then you have to prove that your estimation matches the real variable quite well. But that question of observability in living beings is quite difficult. So can I really get to those parameters that I like to get? And the second thing that is also obvious but quite often forgotten is the term controllability. And that would mean what is the range of control variables that I have? It's like the central heating. You cannot close it more than close, and you cannot go beyond the full opening of your valve. If it's still too cold, you can try to open it more, but it doesn't help. And that is the same with human systems. We have certain limitations that could be degrees of freedom. I mean, I can turn my hand, 180 degrees to the right and probably 100 to the left, but I cannot turn it 720 degrees in one direction. And this is, this is something that is obvious, but you have to consider that when implementing algorithms, because the mathematics does not mind if you insert 720 or 800 degrees. That's then your boundary condition you have to set for the application or the situation you're in. So that is not that easy. If we go beyond the peripheral nervous system, we also have to consider central nervous system effects in the whole thing. We might call that learning on the long-term run and a positive flavor. We have changes in neuronal circuits. And that troublesome question, as already said, if we have changes in the long-term run, we need continuous system modeling update to be on the optimal point for our control. So what does that mean for today's lecture? I first want to focus on the muscle stimulation side and to see where we run into limitations and why we run into limitations and how we can tackle them or what potential options are. And I got a bit desperate yesterday because I've seen many slides in front of my inner eye, what I like to show you, from other persons from conferences, and I did not find them in their publications. So, but I was lucky I found at least one that shows a certain situation quite well. And then we go a little bit into the plasticity of the nervous system, both after injury. That means you cannot, that's also quite often forgotten, you take healthy control persons. And as researcher, that's quite easy. The healthy control persons you always take are your students and they want to graduate, so you have a good reason to ask them to volunteer for a certain study, right? But that's good. But if you, I think it's not honest if I would take you here as subjects in a study on how good you are in standing or in balancing and transfer those results one-to-one as results, let's say, in an aging society where I want to develop something for persons aged 80 or older. I'm pretty sure that their control system, their balance control is different from yours. And that's fine as a starting point, but I'm always criticizing, for example, scientific publications that try to just insert 3 lines and saying, oh, this is all the same than in stroke patients, in paralyzed patients, in elderly, whatever. I don't believe in that. So, and I want to keep you a bit alert that you probably also do not believe that at the first reading then. All right, so that's the outline for today. And what does that mean? And I will jump back and forth today between surface applications and implantable applications. If we go towards implantable applications, we have a time variable response after implantation. So you put something in, and I think you all know that there's something like foreign body reaction. That means tissue grows around the implant and somehow changes the transfer function if you like to record something or to stimulate something because of that tissue that grows around and has a different electrical impedance and somehow changes your situation. It could be also similar in surface electrodes. If you start and you want to do that over certain hours, I mean, today it's freezing cold, so probably not that tricky, but remember the hot days in summer. You can either sweat and thereby get a different transfer impedance over the electrodes. Remember, sweat glands, hair follicles as short circuits through the skin. And if you have something on the top, then you have better conductivity to the deep layers. Or you still do not sweat any longer and you dehydrate because you forget to drink, then you might have a different transfer impedance from the skin to the deep layers. That means also with surface electrodes, there's that changing transfer function over time that you should consider. And you might experience that from your daily life experience. If you learn something new, and depending on the last day, how you slept, how well you feel, if there's something else that troubled you overnight or the last day, you might be able to do that exercise the next day better or worse. And that is the same in rehab. If you stimulate and you place the electrodes on the same side, you can take a marker and make a point or something like that, just by having a different night, having eaten or drunk more or less, you might have a slightly different change in the transfer function, and this is something one should consider. I would say that is, well, this is really troublesome, but this is the easy thing. Yeah, you know it's there and you have to handle that. More difficult is that time variable response after stimulus. And if you talk to the hardcore neuroscientists, they always tell you you should not deliver more than 1 stimulus pulse, because if you deliver 2, the second one can already involve learning. Yeah, that's a bit difficult, right? If you know statistics and things like that. But probably you should take, if you just do it for basic analysis, you should include a certain delay in between. But that means we have a variation after stimuli, and if we wait long enough, it's reversible. That is good and bad at the same time, because if you stimulate over a certain time, you want to make me walk, and that changes after 3 steps, it's not a good excuse that you would say, well, next day the first step will be good again, and sorry, but the other steps will be really lousy, right? So you have to adapt that somehow. One thing is fatigue. So by training, the muscle reduces the output force. And then if you have the feeling you're well again, one would say, well, this is the end of fatigue. But this is not the end of recovery. If you do sports and you There are some training paradigms where you do that interval training, yeah, where you run for whatever 100 meters or 2 minutes, and then you walk slowly for another 2 meters, and you do that again. You feel after a certain period that you really get more exhausted, even though you don't feel that exhausted when you go into from the running into walking. And the reason for that is that your metabolism is not fully recovered. And monitoring metabolism is much more difficult than recording or monitoring electrical activity. And one option for that, that's of course the most difficult one you can imagine, that's magnetic resonance spectroscopy, where you hook on the resonance or the spin, the Larmor frequency of the spins of the phosphorus atoms. And you have the free phosphorus and you have the phosphorus bound in ADP and ATP. And if you have a change in the fraction, you remember ATP, the fuel of the body, and it's split first in ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus free phosphorus, and then you can, in the metabolism, split that ADP into two again, yeah? And this balance can be seen since there's a spin-spin interaction if the P is bound either in the ATP or ADP or is free. But you can imagine this is nothing you get with a mobile smartwatch while pumping in the gym or while running through the forest. This is something for really serious institutes with huge equipment in the background. And then, third level, there is a change after stimulation which is not completely reversible. You could think this is bad on one thing if you look from purely control theory aspect, and say, come on, I want to identify parameters and they don't go back. Or you can call that learning or training. Yeah, if I lose muscle strength and I stimulate the muscle and the muscle gets stronger with that, that has a certain advantage. And I do that over time. Probably the carryover time between two stimuli can get larger and larger, that I do not have to train that often. This could be training. This could be also plasticity of the nervous system. That training, that complex movements get better and better over the training time. Playing piano or something like that. I think I don't have that on another slide, and it sometimes helps to train functionality. I don't know if you have actively seen the hand gesture of paralyzed persons or stroke persons. There is quite often something that looks like a claw grip with that due to some wrong or missing input from the brain in daily movement. And it could be also spasticity, that you have a spasticity that brings a co-activation of finger flexors and extensors, so you have that claw grip and it's completely stiff. And you cannot do or it's even bent with the hand flexors. If you would perform electrical stimulation to train the muscles and you do it in a correct manner that you do not increase spasticity, you see after a certain time, and that is the reason why neither physiotherapists nor the health insurances are that happy in Germany that takes 1 to 2 years to get that right. You can probably not fully suppress the spasticity, but you could change that claw grip in a functional grip. So they have spasticity in a way that they can hold something. That's of course not the ideal therapy, but if you can remove that overflexing of the hand into neutral position with a closed hand, that might reduce pain and increase functionality in activities of daily living. And this is all then related to plasticity. So you rewire somehow the synapses in spinal cord injured persons, for example, on the spinal level. So what basic causes do we have? And you have to compare those lines here with the lines of the last slide. So foreign body reaction is only for the implantation thing. We have fatigue. And this is, as we already had with the selective stimulation, electrical stimulation versus physiological excitation. We do it just the wrong way around, and therefore the fibers get fatigued. And the plasticity starts after injury, immediately the first minutes after injury on certain levels. We have plasticity after electrical stimulation, and this is now mixed here time-wise, effect-wise, and site-wise. We have plasticity in the brain and in the spinal cord, and depending on the subject we are looking at, that matters for that outcome that we have. So the foreign body reaction is seen by changes in the response. So if you stimulate, you might either need a higher stimulation current to get the same effect, or you might get a different effect. And this might be caused by the foreign body reaction. So if tissue grows around something, and now I try to be a bit artistic. Imagine you would have a wire and there would be a stimulation contact on there. And this wire is placed inside of a nerve. And we would have a fascicle here and a fascicle there. And there is a ground electrode wherever. So if we would have an electrical field, that field would probably go that way here, and it would also go that way here. Being attenuated by the substrate, but it's there. It's not just because I want to have it only in one direction, it goes everywhere. But the nerve here would be excited first because it sees a higher current density and is closer to that electrode. If we would, and if we of course increase the current more and more and more and more, then probably also the other fascicle would get activated. If we would now imagine we still have that wire, the same electrode, the same nerve, the same fascicles here. But we have, for certain reasons, an asymmetric foreign body reaction. Let's phrase it that way. Yeah. So due to the insertion, we get here tissue around the electrode. Then the impedance on the left-hand side could be larger than the impedance on the right-hand side, and doing now the same thing, increasing the stimulation threshold, could be that the field has changed a little bit. And that we get this fascicle first, due to that change in transfer function, before we get the other one. And depending where the electrode is, this is an example that happened exactly as I told you. So the electrode was in between two fascicles, and due to certain foreign body reaction, this response switched, let's say, from one effect to the other. If you would have an electrode inside of a fascicle, then you would always get a portion of that particular fascicle. And you would have an increase in the amplitude, but not a switching between two effects. But that would mean you should, over the course of the foreign body reaction, do a kind of mapping from time to time and check out what do I get and do I have to probably change the electrodes for my control purpose. And this is something that sounds so obvious, yeah, that it could happen that way or the other way. But funnily, nobody calculated that before. It was the first time last year that some persons came up and said, hey, there could be a good reason. And if we would simulate that in advance, we could better adapt our control strategies than to the situation, since we know what happens. Yeah, it's always better if you have an idea. Yes, please. You take there are models of a nerve, so about conductivity of perineurium, epineurium, the nerve fibers. You include a certain, and by that you get a voltage over space gradient, and you set a limit where you say that voltage over space gradient is my excitation gradient. You simulate in 3D your substrate and your electrode, and you inject the current and calculate the voltage then over in an finite element model. And by that so-called activation function, that's the second derivative of the voltage over space, you can set a threshold and can predict if that part of the nerve would get excited or the other one due to that second derivative. And then you model and you say, imagine, yeah? Imagine we would have 5 micrometer fibrotic tissue with a higher resistance. Or let it grow to 10, let it grow to 20. Let's place the electrode inside the fascicle, let's place the electrode in between fascicles. And to be honest, that was a tricky one. So there was first a mapping in patients, what they felt over time, and there was that switch between areas where they get the reception. And I have to lie, I think there was, during the explantation of the electrodes afterwards, that was a transient implantation over 3-4 months, a piece of the nerve has been cut out. And histology has been performed afterwards to get the most adequate model of the nerve cross-section, and then starting with those results, that variation in simulation has been done. And with that, they proposed, the colleagues proposed a kind of framework how you can even do that in advance if you have certain data, that you try to align those data with hypotheses to nerve models. So really a bit cool and a bit complex. Yes, please. The conclusions drawn were first is that first it was the question, and the surgeons got completely crazy about that. Did the patient change the electrode position, so has somebody pulled on the cable? Yeah, that could also happen. If you pull on the cable or some movement artifacts that due to muscle movement, the nerve is somehow stretched and you would pull out the electrode. That would be a nightmare. And with that, the conclusions were, no, the electrode stayed in space. It was just the foreign body reaction that was the cause for that switch in perception. And if you do that, well, this is something you could do where you say, well, this is in the range where I find that a reasonable explanation. So it should be still the same. Or if you would find other electrodes where you still have the same perception, then you can say, oh, it seems to be that the electrode is now switching here, so I can adapt my control theory. That was mainly a justification for stability in space as post-explantation study then. But from that, the colleagues developed kind of framework where I could say, hey, shouldn't we do that in advance to see how precise we should be during implantation? so to guide the surgeon, or to find out it doesn't matter. That's also important. If you can tell your surgeon, try to be as precise as possible, but if you're not, it doesn't matter. We can fix that afterwards with kind of theory and simulation. So it's not really in standard operating procedure or in recipe where you do your simulation first and then you can say, I'll do it that way. But it helps you a bit to understand what you see, what you do, and to assess if you're still in a good range with that implant. That's so important. If you start a new treatment approach, everybody is very suspicious if it could work at all, and then you have to find good reasons why your results are as they are. So, and with that, I always think that experience helps to understand theory. That is the reason why I took the heaviest book I found in my cupboard, and I would need a volunteer to demonstrate fatigue here. So any volunteer takes you about 2 minutes to show the obvious. And this the very artistic sketch here already tells you everything. I'm the timekeeper then. It's the task is to stay as less comfortable as possible with that book here, and to see how long you can hold that without trembling. Yeah. Yeah, real exercise. Free exercise. Free and real. So, yeah, to the side. If you feel that it's uncomfortable, you're good. So let's see. I'll take here Stoppuhr. Okay, then we probably should start at 0 and not at 20. Here we go. Now we start. And you all watch what happens, you know? Otherwise, you have to replace him. Not really. I was very impressed. I had a football player, not soccer, really football one, really strong one, ages ago. And this guy did it the shortest time. Already see. So 60 seconds is quite good. We're currently at 40 something. I see something. Do you see something? And say something. Yeah? Do you see him trembling? And the hand goes a bit down, right? But I think it's also trembling a little bit, right? Yeah. So we are now at 80 seconds. And you can relax a little bit, and then you have, please, and we do it for a second time. That is the trick. That is the last line here. Repeat the experiment. Yeah. Yeah, normally you try to compensate to get in a position where you think the lever is shorter, that the force is less, either below or above. And the trick is really to, if you have a very comfortable position, you do that for minutes. But if you're there, you are at a stretch muscle who works at kind of at its limits. That means you don't have a lot of variation in varying the muscle strength. I think this is a minute for recovery. All right, here we go. Much earlier, right? Yeah, we don't put that on social media, so. Yeah. So, but you're really good. So I stop here. 55 seconds. I saw the first trembling already after 20. Um, yeah, probably you can tell what you've seen, and you can afterwards tell what you experienced first round and second round. Yeah. And how did it feel, that uncomfortable position and holding the book there? The
First one was actually okay.
mm-hmm.
Like we had only started like after a minute or so.
Yeah.
But the second one we started quite early, maybe more painful than the first one.
Yeah. And if I would have asked you before, I mean, we all have our daily experience. You know, we expect it somehow. But would you have said your arm felt already good again after 1 minute? No. Okay. Then we were probably a bit too short with the recovery time. And even if you are a bit more recovered, you feel that starts much earlier, which is a good indication that the muscle is already a bit exhausted. And holding a heavy object also means we contract all muscle fibers at once, right? And this is what happens during electrical stimulation. If we just contract a little bit of something when I'm standing here, I feel fine for 90 minutes. If I would do crazy sport exercises, I would not do that for 90 minutes, right? And this is what we should keep in mind with the electrical stimulation. And it's not only that the muscle is contracted, but while the muscle is contracted, the muscle also tends to occlude some blood vessels. That means the exchange of blood and then the oxygen exchange and carbon dioxide and metabolites is also limited there. Yeah, you can imagine if you have a strong muscle and everything contracts, then everything in between is compressed. While having only a little bit contracted here and there asynchronously, you have more chance that the blood vessels really deliver there. And we're not talking about the aorta or something really strong, but we're here in the capillary side where they are no longer that strong, have thin vessel walls and deliver oxygen by diffusion. Yeah. That's a good question. You sometimes the question was for the persons at home. If you train your muscle, if the vessels get better, that's a good question. I never looked that up. I mean, the muscle volume grows. That means you get more fibers. You need less fibers for the same force, and you still do that asynchronously. That means if you would overdo that, pumping in the gym, 150, 200 pounds, then you get tired after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 repetitions, and then you go at rest and start again. That means there is a similar effect, but the major effect is that you train your muscles. And that could be volume. and it could be fiber type, and that comes next. I think everybody knows a little bit about anatomy, function, and innervation, but not that much. So I don't want to overdo it here, but just try to repeat some things from previous lectures and point you into directions if you like to learn more where to look that up. So we have the muscles, and they are innervated. And it's not just one cable ending somewhere, but it's the nerve that spreads up in terminals, and depending on the muscle and its function, we have more or less muscle fibers innervated by one fiber. So our eye muscles have, I guess, 8. Each and every nerve fiber has less than 10 muscle fibers. So that is the reason why we are so good in moving our eyes and having those saccades, so those jumps and the continuous movements. While if you think about your butt muscle, your ability to make funny movements is probably restricted, yeah? And there's no good reason. So nature is always trying to be as efficient as possible. That means we have there a lot of muscle fibers being innervated by a single nerve fiber. Larger motor units, larger force generation. If we don't need that so sophisticated, the body does not have that so sophisticated. The muscle itself is composed of multiple strands, and that means if we have one motor fiber and another motor fiber, there's probably an interlay of innervation, and you can either innervate this subpopulation or the other one, or both of them, having that superposition in time, response, and strength. The muscle fibers itself, we have those myosin and actin filaments that kind of row into each other for contraction. And that means if we pull and stretch the muscle, we cannot stretch it to eternity, then it would tear. So we have minimum amount of overlap. That is where the muscle does not work well. And we have a maximum amount of overlap where the filaments are bumping into those M lines. That means you cannot contract the muscle more as full contraction. Yeah, like an accordion, for example. You can stretch that to the very end, you can push it together, but there are limits in between. And the best is if you have middle size overlap, then you have the best movability to the outside and to the inside. And the muscle needs somehow to be described. We can, if you think about daily experience, you know there are certain muscles which you cannot really train. I mean, your bladder wall muscle is not the more you drink, the better it gets, or something like that. But you can train your arm muscles, or you know, there seems to be a difference in there. And persons try to find that out, and you can look how slow or fast is the contraction. And by that, it turned out if you look on the myosin chain of those elements and combine that with slow and fast contraction, you find 3 types, type 1, type 2A, and type 2B. That's very robust. And you can say, oh, this fiber is slow, or this is fast, and the third one is intermediate. Yeah, so the 2A, it's in between fast and slow. That's robust, but does not tell us really much about the reasons. It's more a phenomenologic classification. You look on that, as in the early days where people tried to compare whatever pigs, snakes, and elephants and found out, well, the snake has no arms and legs. Probably it's a different species than a pig and an elephant. Things like that. Yeah, that's and then it got better and better. And the quantitative is then based on the metabolism. So the question, how does energy consumption or energy transfer take place and can be either oxidative or glycolytic. And as you can imagine, there's also something in between. Some fibers then can do it either one way or the other. This is what we know from exercising. First minutes is more oxidative, and then you get over that point where you want to die or want to stop exercising, and then it switches into the glycolytic one. The thing is that the metabolism can change within the fiber types, and that's difficult to classify then. And this is a science and an art on its own, that fiber classification thing. And we see it here. One of, let's say, the pioneers who did that, and I think he's now either recently retired or will retire soon or is still working after retirement. It's Stanley Selmans from the UK. He did a lot of muscle fiber classification in the context of electrical stimulation and rehabilitation purposes. And if you look on those 4 pictures on the slide, you can identify that they are different versions of the same underlying structure. So either on the right-hand side, you see it's black and two structures are white, and below that the rest, the main picture is white, and 2 structures are grayish, which have more or less the same shape than the ones above. And if you look to the lower left, the C, you see something that looks nearly like the lower right D. And if I now would read the figure caption, you get all the knowledge about that. So they are fast, and I always have to look that I don't tell you the wrong things. In B, there's a staining here. Fibers that stain darkly are 2B fibers. Fibers with intermediate staining density are 2A fibers. Fibers that are barely stained at all are type 1 fibers. That means that is type 1, slow contraction. The grayish ones are 2A, the intermediate ones, and the dark ones are 2B. And depending on the staining, so certain chemical agent that interacts with whatever different agents in the fibers, then either makes the fibers dark or not. And if you use different agents, you can find answers to different questions. So type 1 fibers, slow and capable of continuous activity. That means slow and endurant. The intermediate ones, fast contractions and also endurant, and to be very fast, but only very short time of activity. So this is what we find in general. And the question is, do we always find those? Can they change? Can they be transferred into each other? And what are the reasons for transfer from? And is it a one-way street, or does it go into 2 directions? If we look here, just for you, if you want to look it up, also from that Stanley Selmans article, the important thing for electrical stimulation is the question, how fatigue resistant are they? That's here in the middle line. And the second question might be the power output. And unfortunately, the power output of the fatigue-resistant fibers is relatively low. We have those intermediate ones that are a bit better, but the fast fatiguing fibers are those with a high force output. And as you can imagine, these are the ones who are innervated by thick nerve fibers. That means by electrical stimulation, we get those fast fatiguing fibers always first. That's the challenge and the pity here. Good, and the rest is for you to read that on your own. So the fiber types, as your question was with when it changes, what does happen in the background a little bit. So fiber types vary according to age and training condition. And deep regions contain the slow fibers in a given muscle. That means otherwise, on the other way around, the fast fatiguing are on the surface. And again, if you think in stimulation with if you look with stimulation eyes on that, that will mean I get the superficial fibers first, and they are the fast fatiguing ones. Within a motor unit, so that nerve fiber that splits up, within a motor unit, there's only one fiber type. That's called the fiber grouping. So if I want to play something around with that, probably I should go on that level. And the fiber type is the only thing that is responsible for the degree of fatigue within a muscle. So that is the good thing. You cannot look for another person who's guilty. It's always the fiber type who determines the fatigue tendency. To quantify that, there's a fatigue index. So you measure the force output at the beginning, you measure the force output after a certain period of time, make a ratio out of that, and then you get the fatigue index. And the physiological innovation is such that it meets the requirements that you need. So continuous activation is type 1. If you need something fast in the intermediate level, it's 2A. If you have something, let's say, in a control loop, where you need certain fibers only for short periods of time in balance control, just to bring you back into a certain range where you're stable, then we have those 2A fibers, for 2B fibers for very short intervals. We have in physiology an economic muscle activation. That means we activate muscles only as much as we need it. And there's a kind of optimization in living beings. That means if you have slow fibers, all the metabolism is adapted to the slow fibers. Also the calcium transition in the sarcoplasmatic reticulum. Yeah, thank you. So you might remember if the action potential comes in, the electrical one, then you have that calcium release that goes into the tubuli, and then this causes then with that huge chain of reactions that muscle contraction. And this release is also adapted to the fiber types. So you don't have an overshoot of calcium when you don't need that, because you would need to pump it back, and that would be the second range where you could save energy there. You have asynchronous firing of the fibers, and there's also a kind of non-linear superposition. It has been turned out if you have two action potentials shortly after each other, that's called a doublet, then you have non-linear superposition of the force output. That is more efficient as having two at a longer distance, where you would have regular linear superposition. There you have non-linear one and get a better output. So, and there's a lot of text here, and apologies for that, but I did not find any reasonable pictures, and I don't like non-reasonable pictures there. At once a talk of a colleague who said, I'm doing here data analysis, and if you don't like data analysis, I have local flowers from my home country. I remember all the local flowers of his home country. I have no idea what he talked about. You know, that is so distracting. Even if he said that before, I was not able to focus on the right part. I always was on the other one. So therefore, no figures where I don't find adequate ones. So that fiber transformation. In the intact muscle, that's a reversible process. That's what we all hate if we exercise over the summer, and then I become a couch potato over the winter, and all the training effect is gone. Yeah, and then you start in the spring again. It takes you to fall, and then gets dark and cold, and yeah. You need super threshold activity to get a training effect. That's also true in electrical stimulation. If you would stimulate 3 pulses, then it doesn't mean a thing. And the question is really to find out how much, how long, what strength do I need. And there are some applications where you can do that as a kind of modulation. So use it really as a treatment, and you have a good carryover effect over a certain period of time. And there are others, for example, the cochlear implant, which has no carryover effect. Yeah, if you stimulate your ear, you will not hear when you switch the cochlear implant off, right? That sounds to be obvious, but it's important to mention that. Yeah, there's no carryover effect. So if the nerve is gone, the sensors, they're gone. If you have a muscle and you need more force and you stimulate that, in rehabilitation after stroke, for example, you might have a carryover effect over a day. So you stimulate for an hour and it lasts for a day. That's then the modulatory effect and the adaptivity of the system in the background. And that means we change calcium transport, the force output, and the metabolism there. And if we now compare that electrical therapy with physiology, we have that inverse recruitment that I comment on each and every slide, yeah, that we have the wrong fibers at the wrong time that we get. We have synchronous excitation versus asynchronous. And we have fixed frequency stimulation pulses. And that was what I learned from electrophysiologists very early on. If you record signals and they have a fixed delay in between, very fixed delay, it's never a signal, it's always an artifact. Yeah, physiology has no fixed intervals. You always have a jitter. And if you investigate that jitter, and you would say, how much difference do I have between different pulses, one after the other, and you would plot that in a diagram, you quite often end up with a Poisson distribution there. So if you have fixed intervals, probably the smartphone of your neighbor, probably the router in the hallway, whatever, but that's not physiology. And this is also true for the other way around. If you stimulate, I mean, the easiest thing is fixed frequency, but it could happen in certain circumstances that the brain blanks that out or diminishes the perception. Just by saying, well, I think that's fake. It's something, but it could not be the real signal. Yeah, and therefore, there are some approaches where people say we make a convolution of a fixed frequency signal with an arbitrary whatever stuff to have that jitter being overlaid. The worst thing ever, if we talk about spinal cord injured person, is that after spinal cord injury, nearly all muscle fibers are transferred into fast fatiguing muscle fibers because they are out of use. And that would mean if you have a person, a subject, after spinal cord injury, the first thing is in the intensive care unit to stabilize that person and to secure survival. You don't start training after 10 minutes or a day. You're lying on the ICU, you're getting stabilized, and if you go into rehab after certain weeks or months, your muscles are already in disuse atrophy. And then it takes a long while to train them back and to get that carryover effect. And imagine your spinal cord injury or your has been 6, 8, 10 years ago. That means your muscle is completely gone, and it takes then a very long time to get it back to the first twitch and then to train it in a way, super threshold, that you build up the muscles again. And the question then is this all worth doing it? I mean, if you have an accident and you have paralysis, let's say on one arm, it could have a central cause, or you could have ripped off your nerve fibers out of the spinal cord, and then you have a peripheral nerve lesion. And when you have a peripheral nerve lesion, that means the cell bodies of the nerve cells are destroyed, then no cell without a cell body, right? So there's a degeneration of the nerve cells, and you have no longer an innervation of your muscles. And if your muscle is not innervated, it's really tough to stimulate it. This is what I said in one of the previous lectures with the Cronach C Riobase curve, and we come to that in a minute or two. But on the positive side here, electrostimulation is able to transform the muscle fiber types. That means we can stimulate the fast fibers and try to convert them into slowly fatiguing fibers. That would take some weeks at 10 hertz. And then velocity changes, metabolism changes, and then you get stable 2A fibers from 2B fibers. If you do it in a non-adequate manner, you can elicit spasticity. And this is a very personal comment and probably not state-of-the-art in science. Many persons who are doing excellent physiotherapy do that because they want to work with patients, and they have actively chosen their education. I haven't seen any physiotherapist who is an excellent electrician. And I haven't seen any excellent electrician who's an excellent physiotherapist. But that's probably one of the reasons why electrical engineering and physiotherapy does not go that closely together, at least in Germany, and in the education of physiotherapists and of medical doctors. In other countries, we have still modules in education where this comes in. Unfortunately, we are a bit here in Germany a white spot. With that, all the countries around, so Switzerland, Austria, they have a different curriculum there, and it's still included there, even France. But we're a bit different here, and this is why I'm telling you that if you are, for certain reasons, in such an environment, it's always good to share knowledge and educate. Or try to convince persons there is something that might work. It's not easy, but it's worth doing so. Switzerland is really strong in that, also in the rehab centers, but a colleague and friend of mine told me there it takes up to 2 years to retrain the persons in a way that they can use it with a function in stimulation. And that means you need a certain support structure in rehabilitation and a lot of money behind that to support that. Switzerland is probably a bit better there than Germany is because you have so many mountains, and Swiss persons always do hazardous sports, right? So they are happy to find good rehab if something happens, and they're also happy to donate money to support the structures there. A lot of things are really working on donations in Switzerland there in the rehabilitation centers. There's a call in the general newspapers, on social media, and after some weeks they have the money together. Very impressive there. Here, the applications that I found for that are unfortunately a bit died out applications. So the phrenic pacemaker means electrical stimulation to support breathing in persons with a C3 spinal cord injury, so really high at the neck, where you can stimulate the phrenic nerve to pace the diaphragm. That works well, but is an implantation, and a lot of anesthesiologists and patient are more in favor of having a tracheostomy and get overpressure insufflation. And the good thing is that those ventilation units got smaller and smaller over the last decades, so you can put them under your wheelchair and you're fine with that. And the other one is the cardiomyoplasty, which I guess mentioned earlier on with the stimulation pulses. That was the idea if you're waiting for donor heart after heart failure or nearly heart failure, that one of your shoulder muscles, the trapezius, was wrapped around the heart and retrained to get slowly fatigued for stimulation. And then it turned out that it tends to calcify and does not like to transfer the force as good as needed. Right, so also seen here, if you hold something, you have a smooth contraction. If the fast fibers drop out after fatigue, you get trembling. This is nothing you want to have in rehabilitation, that people tremble while grasping or tremble while standing or something like that. So you need a certain force, but the higher the frequency gets, the faster the force drops. And as we see in that experimental graph, fast means already after less than a minute, the force is below 50% of the initial one. Please do not ask me why there is something above 100%. That might be a measurement error or an experimental flaw somewhere from the setup. But that means we need a certain frequency to get the effect, and on the same side we get fatigue. So how can we solve that? I mean, if we breathe, we can say, oh, this is only 8 times per minute. Yeah, there is a natural pause in between the breathing, but if you grasp something and you want to drink, for example, probably you should grasp longer than 30 seconds. Otherwise, you would drop your coffee mug or your jar while drinking. One option is to have a pulse-pause relationship that works during breathing, 1 second on, 5 seconds off, or something like that. If you grasp, you cannot say, oh, I switch it on for 1 second and leave it off for the second and switch it on for the third second again. So that's really tough. We have to see how this really goes. This is here a German translation of an English textbook. The functional electrical stimulation. Benton and Baker were both rehabilitation doctors at the Los Alamos Rehab Center. That was also one of those centers who were the first in the iron lungs in the polio epidemics in the 50s before. And that was something I did not know. So I always wondered why iron lungs in the 1950s. And it turned out that the ventilation we are knowing nowadays for surgical interventions with a tube in the windpipe, that was invented in the 60s, 70s. So that was really a gap in there, and that was one of the reasons why the iron lungs came that fast to application there. Up to the mid-60s or something like that. Polio was nearly died out. I was still on that age, one of the last years where you got that in school. Well, there were pox and polio. I was too young for the pox. They were already 2 years before me. But polio was still until the 70s or something like that you get the vaccination as mandatory thing. I was nearly died out due to travel, international travels and certain religious opinions. We have a lot of polio cases still, Afghanistan, Pakistan-wise. Lot of campaigns are there, but it comes back. It comes back in the wild type, and therefore it's not that bad to check up if your polio vaccination is still active. And I say that because that phrenic pacing was also in that context, not only spinal cord injury, but also in polio. The infection goes very fast on the myelin sheath, and people need at least intermittent insufflation for that period until they recovered. So here we go. I thought I forgot. I deleted that. If we have denervation, things are different. In spinal cord injury, we break our spine, but the nerves are still intact below the trauma level. So we still have the nerves in the spinal cord going through the muscles and the efferent nerves going from the muscles back to the spinal cord. That means if we stimulate, we still have intact muscles that we approach. If that peripheral nerve is damaged, there is nothing to stimulate but the muscle. And it's not only that the nerve fibers degenerate, but also the neuromuscular junctions. And if a neuromuscular junction vanishes, the surface of the muscle changes. That would mean even if you would wait now for a year or 1.5 and the nerve would regrow slowly, 1 millimeter per day or something like that, it might happen that the nerve then approaches the muscle and the surface has changed that much that no longer any neuromuscular junction can be established after that. That is one of the things why a partial paralysis still remain or sensitivity changes after cutting with a chainsaw into your finger or something like that, where you really destroy the nerves. If you have regeneration and it's successful, you might have changes in the size of the larger motor units. That has been discovered, I guess, first after those polio epidemics, that persons had different shape of gait, for example, after polio, because the motor units grew larger. And there should be still fiber grouping. That means fibers in vicinity go to the same target here. In the non-denervated muscle, if I stimulate, I get that regular strength duration curve. That would mean I have between 70 and 150 microseconds of Cronach C, so twice the value of the Rio base curve. If I change the pulse width and increase the amplitude and ask you, when do you feel something, and look, when do you have your motor twitch, I get that sensory curve and the motor curve. If I have a denervated muscle with that destruction of peripheral nerves, atrophy of muscle, I need thresholds in current that are probably not 2 to 10 milliamps with a superficial electrode, but far above 100 milliamps, and pulse width that are in the hundreds of millisecond range. There was a European study on peripheral damaged nerves and muscle stimulation, and they had to change the international standard to be allowed to apply that much of current there. And they had to change the electrode sites that you don't have, you know that from field theory, experimental physics 2 or something like that. If you have field lines and you have a metal plate, and if you have a boundary in insulator, you have a lot of field lines at the edges. And if you have such a huge current, you might have that at the edges that causes such a high current density that you get burns of third order in the patients. And since they are paralyzed and have no longer sensory fibers, they don't feel that. They do that therapy, and afterwards they take off the electrode and find that they burned themselves. So that was a huge development to change the electrode sites there in a way that you have smooth transitions with no high field strength. The situation that you get is something I tried to find yesterday, and this was the only picture I found from an artificial organs article. And my dear colleagues here, Paolo Gargiulo and Tordur Helgason, they work in Iceland and Reykjavik. This is, I think it's an arm. Should be a leg, to be honest. I didn't look that up. This is a healthy cross-section or cross-section of through a healthy limb. This is the bone. And this is the muscle around here. And the black is whatever is in there, fibrous tissue and the skin on top of that. And a bit of fatty tissue. And it depends how you do the X-ray or the MRI to highlight fatty tissue, fibrotic tissue, muscle, and the rest. And this is another person after peripheral nerve damage. And if you do segmentation and tissue classification, you see that this is the remaining muscle tissue that is left. And the rest is fat, fibrotic tissue, and skin. And this is the point from which you have to start when you try to train the muscle. First thing. Second thing is that people are already then in the wheelchair, and you can imagine if you it's not only in the legs, it's also in your butt. That means no muscle left. If you sit, it's really pain, and you might get ulcers, so open skin, since there's nothing in that really dampens, attenuates your weight and your movement. You have to stimulate at least 2 hours a day, and what came out after that 5-year study was that there's nearly no carryover effect. That means no training carryover effect. As you know, by training, if you run like crazy in the summer times and then you rest for 2 weeks, you can still continue running after those 2 weeks, and you're fine. Here, the case is if you stop for a week or two, all the training effect is gone. It takes you a year to get the muscle built up, to change it, to reduce a little bit the fibrous tissue and the fatty tissue, and if you rest for 2 weeks, it's nearly as at the beginning. That was one of the reasons why people got a little bit fed up and are not really prone to continue. You know, if you have that situation where you say, well, it takes me, and you have a lot of side effects which cover you all, which keep you busy all the day long, right? So it's not that you're sitting there, what could I do to today? And then it was really not that successful to bring that into patients. Yes, please.
This is only for the innervated muscle.
Right. If you,
Why?
because I've no, I've no good reason. So it could be that there are, if you do not activate your muscle, you still have from time to time an action potential traveling over the nerve and activating your muscle. And this must be a kind of, I would call it now, memory effect, that things stay stable. And if there's nothing like there, the muscle probably says, well, I'm no longer needed, I'm going away. I've no good reasons, so I don't, as far as I know, I haven't seen any paper that gives you, let's say, the molecular reasons for that. It's more that rehabilitation engineering is always more on that phenomenological side, seeing what happens. And there's probably one paper where I did not look it up in a completely different region of pathophysiology on the molecular side. I've no idea why this happens, but I can tell you this is really the main difference between central paralysis and peripheral paralysis. Well, not central. So central damage and peripheral damage, that as long as the nerve fibers are there, it could be, well, and you don't see that very much just from looking on that. It could be that the patient with central paralysis might look like the middle picture here after 10 years of disuse, but if you see, oh, there's a twitch, and I'm in that chronoxyria base curve, which predicts that should be a central part of the paralysis, then stimulation is helpful to train that up, to get better with a carryover effect. So you can give good promises and good outcome predictions into the therapy, while the therapy in peripheral nerve damage helps you for the minute, but does not really help you. I say if you torture yourself very much, we can reduce the intensity over time. You can, if you like torturing yourself, you can start now, and you have to do it every day, and then it could get better. But it turned out that the outcome varied also very much in between the patients. So there are other effects underlying that probably come on top of that. Your basis of your question, right, that is not yet fully discovered. So with that, I think I have to hurry up a little bit with those few slides that I have. I let them come on here. This is what I already told you in all the lectures before. Some measures that we can take is, for example, taking nerve electrodes instead of muscle electrodes, that we can vary the recruitment of different subgroups more sophisticated. There's a roundabout stimulation, in German called Karussellstimulation. So we take certain electrodes around the nerve, and we take one or the other, and with that we have different subpopulations that we recruit. We can use high spatial resolution stimulation, so the smaller the subgroup we address, the more variable the variation is. We can use quasi-stochastic stimulation pulses, and this is something which is completely out of my understanding how that works. There's even now a very crazy thing that people say you should stimulate in the upper 100 kilohertz range, where nerves are not able to respond, but if you do that long enough, there's certain local accumulations of something, and then from time to time, an stochastic action potential then occurs. Sounds really cool. But I think to transfer that into a predictable medical device where you can convince your general health insurance to reimburse you might be a long way, right? So it's still in the very fundamental side. Which goes much better is that spinal cord stimulation if you can approach the central pattern generator in the lumbar spinal cord. There are certain clinical trials going on currently in the US and in Switzerland, but the outcome is still a bit variable, let's phrase it that way. So some patients respond well, others don't. So still some more studies needed. With respect to the plasticity in the nervous system, so you might know that famous saying from Happ, one of the early 2000s neurophysiologists, nerves that fire together wire together. So if you have a certain co-activation, then synaptic strength is increased. That's not true everywhere, but there's a ground truth behind that. So reaction times might change, spinal reflexes might change, and cortical organization might change. And sometimes it does, and there are other situations where it doesn't. So, but in general, you could say there's a certain plasticity everywhere. We have those changes after spinal cord injury, after amputation, and after loss of sensory functions. There are some studies, for example, that blind persons who are really good in reading Braille, that tactile perception, have activation of the visual cortex while reading Braille, even though they are blind. So that's kind of, for me, kind of crazy. So there are neurophysiological changes going on. It's the same situation, well, completely different stuff, but I think similar underlying mechanisms. If you grow up bilingually, the languages are stored differently in the brain as if you learn your second or your foreign language later on. There are some experiments with stroke patients. So where stroke patients who learned foreign language in their late childhood or adulthood, they got a stroke and they forgot the foreign language, while bilingual people did not, even though they had the stroke in the same spot in the brain. That means it's a kind of intermingled in bilingual persons, while it's kind of separated in adults.
Concerning the blind people, do you know whether these people were from birth on blind or if these were blind all the way?
I cannot tell you. No, I cannot remember. I think there are differences. There's also, I mean, seeing is well, the question always is, if you see something, is this objective what you see, or is there are all those downstream modulations that you learned after some weeks after birth, where the sense of vision develops, where you not have only the input of the light, but also the downstream from the visual cortex to other areas in the brain that kind of interpret your perceptions that you have. And this is a strong modulation where attention taps in later on, or selective attention, task-dependent things. If you get a task, you see the same thing, but you respond faster if you have learned the task, because that channeling of information happens in a different manner, even if the objective incoming light is the same. Yeah. And I don't know. I think those were patients who have seen before, because they're those early nasty experiments with guinea pigs. If you raise them in dark environment, that the visual system is not developed, because you need the light for the development of that, and I think if it's not there, you cannot take advantage of that system. But that's all a bit of mixing up old stories and things I read over the last 40 years or something like that. Yeah, the measurements are important. If you hypothesize something, then you should prove that in measurements, and we can measure reaction times. We can take advantage of electrophysiological methods like the EEG. We can modulate brain activity by transcutaneous magnetic stimulation and see what the outcomes are. Can use magnetoencephalography. That is a measurement method with the magnetical signals of the brain. And magnetic dipoles are always orthogonal to the electrical dipoles, if you remember the basics of physics and induction and something like that. And since we have a lot of sulci, we could not measure the electrical signals there from the surface of the brain, but we can using magnetoencephalography. The standard machines are huge and need fluid nitrogen to get cooled, to have superconducting sensors, so it's nothing you can carry around. But there are new quantum mechanical devices with gas and light and fancy things that work at ambient temperature and under movement, at least in the marketing leaflet. And we hope we have something here, and we hope we can colleagues make it work in the next 2 years, that we can really do MEG in freely moving patients without a shielded room around. So cool stuff going on. Yeah, and then we have fMRI. So as said, for example, phosphorus spectroscopy or oxygen measurement in the Bolt measurement, so blood oxygen saturation that you can measure in the MR. Or PET, positron emission tomography in nuclear medicine, where you check up decay times and see where activation takes place at which time scale. Yeah, and physiological things. I'm nearly at the end here. Changes in behavior, and you can play some tricks to mask or demask certain things due to the experiments. We have slow changes, that's more growing out, new synapses, ramification of new dendrites and things like that. And a lot of neurotransmitter systems involved, and if you look on those, these could also be those transmitter systems that interact then with the health or with the disease of the muscle fibers. Consequences beyond the obvious, that you cannot use it any longer. We get phantom pain after amputation as one of the consequences of non-desired plasticity. In spinal cord injury, you got demasking of spinal reflexes, things that have been overwritten by voluntary control, could be either spasticity. In spinal cord injury, you can empty your bladder while tapping on the belly. You should not try it out now. Normally, it doesn't work. It does not work if you're healthy. I can tap on my belly and don't have to pee here. But these are things that happen there. We have loss of sensory functions with the observation that complementary senses get stronger. Yeah, and overtake. So if you're blind, you might hear better. If you're deaf, you know, those observations there. And we can take it also as therapeutical opportunity, that plasticity to change something voluntary as effect of the treatment. So with that, the summary summarizes all the things I've said many times for today, so don't want to repeat that. What should you take home as educational targets from that lecture? It's that you know that there is fatigue and plasticity, that you have a bit an idea where it comes from, what the fiber type thing is behind that, where it comes from, and the differences in physiological and technical excitation of muscles, that you can say, well, physiology is that way, but here we go the other way. And some ideas to prevent fatigue by electrical stimulation, with mainly here with surface electrodes or with highly spatial resolution in implants. With that, I'm nearly at the end. One last sentence before I close. The evaluation period started again. I know that everybody bothers you, but I have to do that too. We find that very important. We definitely want to have your feedback, but that means you have to give feedback. And I need 10% of students, at least 5 persons. Yeah, that's a double limit. So if we would be 40, the minimum would be 4, but 4 is not 5, so I would not get any feedback from the delivered evaluation results. So at least 5 persons should deliver feedback. If more, I'm happy. Please use the free text field for friendly and constructive criticism. Then I can put that in. If somebody writes, the lecturer is an idiot, it hurts a bit and doesn't help at all. So please use that option of democracy and support us in giving your feedback, that we are able to change then our lectures, our way of approaching things. I think it's important for each and every lecturer here at the university, so please take part. Thank you for that, and then hopefully see you all again next week for the safety and hazard thing in electrical stimulation next week. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.